Redux is a powerful tool, but are you sure you know how to use it? In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into state management and covering Redux persistence and the Redux store, as well as the file and folder structure with our Redux implementation. In this video, we're going to cover React State, Context API, Redux State, and state persistence. We're going to learn how to create and manage our React.JS state in this video. Stay tuned. We're going to do a complete deep dive. I hope this helps. Before we get into the code, I just want to recap what Redux is. Redux is a state management tool. It's a NPM package, node package manager. And this is a tool that you can use in your React.JS project to manage your global state, or state that must persist upon refreshes or reloads, right? So in this Redux state, you have actions, you have reducers, and then you have your store. The action fires off essentially what the reducer tells. The reducer basically sets up the logic, and the action fires it off. And then the store is what manages all that state. So anywhere in your application, you can manage this state, or you can access this global state. And so it's very handy if you if you want to authenticate a user and save their data somehow, rather than save it in cookies or whatever, or it's a less secure way. What I like to do is I like to store my state, my global Redux state, for authentication. So my user logs in, the authentication information is saved in the Redux state and modified as things change and progress along the way. So let's get into the code now, and I'll explain more as we go. So I'm just going to assume you have a React project already ready, up and running. If not, you can run npx create React app and then call it client or whatever you want. So I'm going to run npm run start. So I'm in my app.js, in my source, in my client, my React project. So we're going to cover state first. So we need to import React, deconstruct the use state value, and I'll explain that in a moment, from React. Okay, so use state here, this use state, what that does is that basically allows us to create local lexical state in our app.js component. The problem is with Redux is global, use state. So if we do const state, set state, and then use state, so we just have an empty value state there. But if we were to use this, this is only scoped to the app.js, the app component, whereas Redux could be accessed there, well, not there because the app starts there, but any other component. So say we have components, and then we have a pages folder. So say we have pages and components. Anywhere in those two, the Redux would be accessible because our store is initialized, and it's accessible everywhere, essentially. So looping back to the state here, let me explain what state is. State is basically a way, it's a variable, it's a value. It's like an updatable value, basically, within your local lexical scope of that component. So say I have a component that I nest in here. There's a way of passing state, and that's called props. We're not going to cover that here, but helper component, and then I could pass the value, state value. I could pass that to my nested components through props, but we're not going to cover props in this video. I'll cover another video on that down the road. But state, it can only be passed down. It cannot be passed up, but rather just down. And state is a way of, it's basically variables, essentially, as a broken down form. So you can also assign, there's two ways of doing this. You can do value set value equals use state. You can do it like this, or you can do it like this. The beauty of this is you can assign value 2, value 3, and so on and so forth, right? Whereas you would have to create another one and another one. So it just gets kind of messy. The way you would update that state, so say I have a use effect. This is when the component mounts. It's a component lifecycle method. Don't worry about that. I'm using this for reference. So if I want to update this state, I would do a similar, like when I have a class-based, I do this set state, and then I update the state. It's very similar to that. However, it's set state, and then you want to take the previous state and then a fat arrow function, a callback, or a function, I mean, not a callback, and then dot, 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 previous state, and then whatever value you want to update. And I'll explain this in a moment, but say value 2, we want to update to true, okay? And we'll put that in a string true. Okay, so what it's doing here is it's setting the state. It's taking the function that updates the state. It's taking the previous state, so all of this existing previous state, whatever that may be, whatever the values are, and then it's updating only value 2. So it's taking this state and only updating this value to true as a string true or a Boolean true. We'll just keep it a Boolean to keep it simple. And the way you would use this one would be like set value true. A lot more simple, yes, a lot simpler. Yes, I get that, I understand that. However, this is much cleaner and much more easier to use than to just assigning tons of these things, you know? So it's best practice in my opinion. Now that we've briefly covered what state is and how to use state, I don't want to do a deep dive into state. I want to focus this predominantly on context, API, and mainly Redux. That's what we're going to get to here in a moment. But we first need to cover the context API first, and then we'll move on to Redux, the file folder structure, what are reducers, what are actions, what is the store, how do we persist the store, so on and so forth. So what is the context API? The context API is a built-in React feature that allows you to share state across multiple components without prop drilling and or basically passing props through components like we did here, right? So it simplifies the passing of multiple layers of props. It provides a simple way to manage global state without using Redux or external libraries. It's predominantly better for small to medium-sized applications. And when should you use it? When you have a lightweight global state such as theming, authentication, user settings, things of that nature. When Redux is overkill, you would want to use it then too. So small to medium-sized apps. And basically whenever you want to avoid prop drilling. So let's break into that. Let's jump into that here. I'll give you a real-time example. Get rid of this. And then we'll move on to Redux, the fun stuff. So here I have an example of the Create Context API, the theme provider, which will then be wrapped, which will wrap the app.js here. But for now, let's go back to that. So we create the context, we import that from React and create context and assign that to theme context. We have our component that we're exporting, our theme provider. And then what we're doing here is we're basically exporting multiple different packages. So we're exporting the theme context and then the theme provider. So what we'll do is we'll go into our index.js and we'll import theme provider from theme context. And then we're going to wrap the theme provider around the app.js, and then that context API will be available within our application. So let's go back to that and recap. So we're toggling the theme here. That's just one example of how you can update the state, the context state. So you have the theme is default as light, and then we update it to dark or light depending on what mode it's in. And yeah, and then that theme context provider wraps the children. So the children being the app.js or the app component. So that's basically the theme context. That's how you configure the context API. Now I just realized that we actually need to import context, theme context, just normally. So in our index.js, we can just get rid of that. That's imported as a default. Note that in the theme context, it's exported as a default item. So we don't need to deconstruct that. We do need to deconstruct the theme provider though. So back in the app.js, we're going to use this theme context, and I'll show you how this works. So first we need to import use context from React, the package. And then in the use effect here, I'm going to, well actually I'll go up here where the state is. I'll go const theme toggle theme equals use context, and then I'll pass that theme context. Okay? And then what we want to do is, well, let's just put a button in here. on click toggle theme from our action here, our update state, the update the context state, the toggle theme there, and then we'll just do click me. And that will update, that calls the toggle theme, which you can see is right here, and that will change the state. It'll call the update for the context state. All right, guys, now we're gonna get into the Redux, the fun part. So first things first, we need to basically organize our folder file structure for Redux. So we're gonna create a folder here called Redux. In that Redux folder, we're gonna create another nested folder called Actions. And then in the Redux folder again, we're gonna create reducers, just like that. And then we're gonna create one more called Store. And then in Store, we're gonna create a file, not a folder, a file called store.js. And now we're gonna go into the reducers folder and create our root reducer. This will combine all of our reducers, or all of our logic telling the actions what to do. It'll combine them all into one, which we can import into the store and then utilize in our application. So we have the root right there, and then our actions, say we want to create a authentication route or authentication logic for our users with Redux, then I would do authentication or auth. I can shorthand that for auth. And then auth.js. Say I also wanted to do theming, and then I could have one there as well, theme.js, and so on and so forth. So all of your actions, you want to separate or segregate all of those separate specific functions into their own specific like folder or area, I should say. So what we're going to do is the store first, and then the reducers, and then the actions. So we're going to create, we also, real quick, for the folder file structure, we need to create the auth for the auth action. And then we need to create, in the reducers folder, we also need to create the theme.js for the theming. Whoops. Just theme, and then inside of that, theme.js, or whatever you want to name your reducer. But try to keep the naming convention the same as the actions so they correlate. All right, back in the store, we need to first install a couple dependencies. Let's see here, so let's close this. npm I for install, and then we're gonna install Redux, Redux Thunk, React, Redux Persist, Redux Promise, and then Flatted. And that should be good for now. So we're going to install those. And those are all the dependencies that we'll need in order to get started. We'll come back to these if we need to install some more stuff. And in the store, we're going to import, let's see here. We need to import create store, apply middleware, and compose from Redux. Oops, Redux. And then we're going to import thunk, lowercase thunk, from React thunk, or Redux thunk, sorry. And then we have like 4 more packages to import. Import persist store. We got to bring the curly bracket because we're deconstructing this. Persist store, persist reducer, and create transform from Redux Persist. Let me word wrap this so this all stays in one screen. All right. And then we need to import storage from, what was that? Redux Persist / storage. Import promise middleware from Redux Promise. And you might be asking, why do we have to import all these packages? Well, Redux is like a very intricate, elaborate state management tool. So we need to set our store, which is going to manage all of our reducers and actions and so on and so forth. This is the core, the crux of all of it. So we need to make sure we configure this first and then move on to our reducers and actions, because without the store, the reducers and actions cannot function. So this is the most important part, I would argue. And I'm setting you up so that you can persist your state upon page refreshes. So like if on this page right here, if I reload this, then it persists. If I reload, it persists, so on and so forth. So I'm setting you up for success here. Just follow along, and you'll be happy that you did. So we're going to import stringify and parse, and I believe this is from the flatted library. And now what we want to do is we want to const transform circular, and then create transform. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have inbound state and then key. Well, we don't need the key actually. Don't worry about that. Just inbound state. And then we're going to stringify inbound state. And then we need to put a comma and then another callback here, another function, outbound state, and then parse outbound state. And that should configure our transform circular. So basically it's stringifying the inbound state, and then it parses the outbound state, if that makes sense. And then now we're going to create our persist config object. So persist config, and then we're going to do key primary, and then storage and transforms into transform circular. Okay, so now you can see why we have that. That's going to be passed to our Redux Persist config object. This is the most labor intensive file, so just bear with me. P reducer equals persist reducer. P reducer means persist. That's shorthand for persist. You can name that whatever you want. Just you'll have to use it relevant to whatever your naming convention is. And then persist config in all reducers. And then we need to import all reducers from reducers and then root reducer there. And it's just React.JS. That's not well, that is created, but we have nothing in there yet. That's that root file right there. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to do one more variable, and it's going to be called compose enhancers. And this is going to be window dot underscore underscore redux dev tools extension compose or compose. And we're almost done. We're almost done here. We're going to start exporting our store const store, and that's going to be create store with our P reducer right here, our persist config reducer, P reducer, compose enhancers, apply middleware, thunk, and promise middleware. And that's going to export our store right there. So this is basically our store essentially right here. However, we need to basically persist that store. So we got two more lines of code. So we need to export const persistor, and then persist store, and then pass it the store value. And then store subscribe, and let's pass that a callback with nothing in there. And then we're going to say console log, and then store is now store get state. And what this is going to do is subscribing to the store object. So that's our created store right there. And then anytime there's a change, it'll log the change. So any single change, any fine change, whether small or large, will be logged right here as an object. The store state object will be logged there, and you'll be able to see that in your console here. You'll be able to see that in your console. So now that we have the store configured, we need to save this, and now we need to bring it into the app.js. So we need to basically bring this into our main component so that we can utilize it. We need to wrap basically our component. However, instead of app.js, we're going to wrap index.js because that's where our theme provider is. You typically want to wrap your app with any providers. You want to wrap here. So we're going to import at the top here, provider from React Redux. And then we want to import our store from Redux store. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do provider and then store equals store and then close that off. And I'm just going to copy this logic and paste it. So now we have our Redux store configured. Our Redux store is now ready to go and it's available. But now we need to configure the, let's see here, the reducers as well as the actions so that we can actually do things with our Redux store. So if you open up your browser, you should see the store object, but we have a small error here. We have a typo. Persist config is not a function. So in here, this persist config, this should be persist reducer. And also make sure you change the persist, Redux persist storage. Make sure there's a lib, L-I-B in the middle before storage, or you'll get an undefined error with that as well. But if we go to the browser, we can see base reducer is not a function. And the reason why it's not a function is because we don't have a function yet in our root reducer. So let's go ahead and create a reducer here in our auth.js and then an action to show you what those look like, and then we'll break those down further. All right, guys, so we're actually going to create the action first because it's a lot more simple than the reducer. It's just a little bit more complex with the reducer, but the action is pretty simple, and we need that for the reducer because we're going to have to import that. I will break this down on the blackboard or the whiteboard over there, but we're going to program this out first, and then I'll break down the concept of what we're doing in more theory-wise after we get done with this. So first things first, we need to import our type, which assigns the type that we're using essentially. So I'll explain that momentarily too, but types.js. So now let's create that type. A type is basically a string that is assigned to a constant. So export const auth equals auth. And this is the string associated or assigned to that const value that is used in here, right here, for that action. Let's save that and let's go back to our action. And let's now create our action. So export const authentication and then a function with the item, or this is the best practice actually is payload, because that's the payload that is being sent or funneled from the reducer. A payload is basically just data essentially. And then we're going to return type auth and then the payload. So this is equivalent to payload, but we want to deconstruct that so it looks cleaner. It's best practice, and that's ES6 syntax that we're using here. But instead of just doing payload, right, that looks kind of terrible. It's the same value, so we can just get rid of that, and it automatically knows to assign payload to payload. Now that we have our action created, we can go to our reducer, and mind you, the reducer is what tells the action what to do. So we're going to import auth from types. So we're going to go out one folder, two folders, into actions, and then into types, and import that auth string so the reducer knows who it's assigned to. And we're going to do const initial data, or initial state, that's better. And then we're going to do data, and then empty object. And then now we want to export default, and then we want to say state equals initial state if there is no state. So when we first start, initialize the state to this. And then we want to do the action as the next parameter or argument, and then a function. Now what we want to do is a switch statement, and we're going to do action. And because all these objects, right, this reducer can handle multiple actions. And so if we had different actions with different types, we could use all of those actions in the same reducer. However, you want to segment the reducer to specifically what its task is. So all the auth-based stuff would be in here, all the theme stuff would be in here, so on and so forth. So we're going to do auth. We're importing that auth type. So if it's the auth string, because in the types here, it's a string of auth. If it's the auth string, then what we want to do is return state and then the data. So this data right here, we're going to assign to action payload. Action right here and the payload. So that's how we get that payload value, right? When I started Redux, it was really confusing with the reducers because I didn't know what payload was. Like, what the hell is that? You know, how do I get payload off of action? Well, it's taking the action that's firing this off and the value associated with it, payload. So if this was test, then this would be like action test, so on and so forth. So, but it's payload because that's naming conventions that you want to use with your actions because it is the payload, right? So you want to use best practices and best naming conventions. And so if I had more, I could put them here, like I could put another, and then so on and so forth, but we're not going to do that. So now that we have our reducer and our action ready here, we can actually do the root logic. So what the root logic does is it combines this reducer, and any other reducers that we have. It combines them all into one central location, and then we import that as all reducers into the store, pass that to the persistence, and then create the store with that P reducer, that persisted reducer. So the last leg here is basically setting up the root reducer. So we're going to import combine reducers from Redux, and then we want to import all of our reducers. So right now we only have the auth reducer right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to import it as auth reducer from reducers, auth, and then auth.js. And then we're going to do combine reducers. Whoops, wait, we need to actually export default combine reducers and then an object. And then we're going to do auth as auth reducer. So now when we access our store, we access the auth property, and that will be relevant to the auth reducer or the auth action data. So let's save that, and then let's go into, well, that should load now. So let's check our browser. Guys, so I looked at my browser and the error was still there, and I realized something. I have two roots, the combined reducers, I mean. So I'm gonna just paste this here, and then I'm gonna remove the outermost layer reducer there, because that's not in the reducer folder. And here we go. So now we got another error, reducers auth, module not found. Make sure that's saved. Make sure that's saved. And that's going to be in our store at 20. Store at 20. Oh, so it's this one right here. I don't need to go all the way out. I just need to, whoops. I just need to go into auth and then auth. Now we're getting the slice reducer for the auth return to undefined value. If the state past the reducer is undefined, you will explicitly return the initial state. So I gave this to ChatGPT, and one little error that we made here in the reducer is action is actually action type. One little typo there. And the reason why it's action type is because, like I said, if we go back, so same principle for the action payload, the payload here, action type needs to be assigned as well because it's checking for type, action type, auth, and then auth, the type. So this is a valuable learning lesson to point out that the action must correspond to your reducer. And one other side note for something I missed here, for the default case scenario, we need to return the state. The state here or the initial state. If it doesn't match anything or if it's not matched yet. So let's load the browser. And bam, guys, look, we have our auth data right here from our Redux store. Store is now. That corresponds to our store here. At the very bottom, store listening, store is now, and then the store state. So also I had to delete the context, theme context. I think there was some issues with that merging with the Redux because we have them both in here, the theme provider. So I think that was causing some issues. So I commented that out just to be safe. But it gave me like some basically configuration errors. So there might be, so double check the logic on the theme context in your app.js if you were following along with me. But now that we have our project running here, we are going to actually dispatch an action here and update that action, that Redux state with this click me button. So now what we're going to do is we're going to import our action from our actions folder. So I'm going to go to the top here and import authentication from, and that's going to auto import in my Visual Studio, but Redux actions auth. And then clean this up a bit. Let's get rid of this junk. And in the button, we're going to do a callback, or a function, I mean, sorry. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do authentication true. So what that's going to do is that's going to change this value data to true. Let's give that a whirl and let's watch the state update, and then we'll give the page a refresh to make sure it persists upon reloads. So authentication equals true. Got that imported. Oh, right. And then also 2 more crucial steps. We need to import and deconstruct at the top authentication. And then there's this thing called import connect. There's this thing called connect from React Redux. If you forget this syntax, it's always the same. But basically, you want to take connect down here and wrap app with connect. And then in this connect, we have 2 arguments or parameters. We're going to pass null for the first argument and then authentication for the second argument. This null is basically if you want to pull off values, map state to props, state, and then return whatever your store state is. So like if I wanted to deconstruct the auth from auth data, I could do auth state auth data. And then I could access that if I passed that prop, if I did map state to props, and I passed that prop auth and deconstruct it at the very top here. So let's give this a save. Don't worry about this logic. We'll break into that in a moment. But just worry about the second argument should be a destructured authentication. And then make sure you have it here at the top. And we'll give this a save and give it a whirl. So we should see this value update to true. And there we go. Data, auth data true. So now let me show you the map states to prop, or map state to props. So if I console log that, this is the special state and then state. It gives us identical to what the store gives us. It's a way of accessing the store in your components. So you must use this connect value here, this connect function, and then pass map state to props. Or if you don't want to use it, you can just pass it null. And then authentication or whatever your function is, your action, deconstructed as a second argument, and then your function name for your actual component here. Yeah, I'm hoping this makes sense, but that is how you access your Redux state values in your components. So let's give this a save, and you see there, right there. So let's reload this and make sure this persists. And if we reload this, we can see that the store is still true. Bam. I hope I was able to provide some insight here and some knowledge and help you guys get a better understanding of Redux and React state management. If this video was helpful, please leave a like or a subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. It helps me out tremendously. Yeah, happy programming.